The summer I turned 18, my parents surprised me with news of their upcoming trip to Europe. They had been planning this for years, a full month traveling between Italy, France, and Spain, exploring vineyards, museums, and historical sites. The idea was thrilling for them, but the reality for me was less exciting. Rather than leaving me home alone, they arranged for me to stay with my grandmother, Elise, at her countryside home. "You'll be fine," my mom said, patting me on the shoulder. "It's just a few weeks, and Grandma would love the company." I couldn't say no. After all, my grandmother had always been good to me. She was warm, loving, and had a quiet elegance that made her seem timeless. Her house was a sprawling old place nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, peaceful, but a far cry from the busy city life I was used to. When I arrived, Grandma Elise greeted me with open arms, her embrace warm and familiar. "Come in, darling. You're just in time for lunch," she said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Though I'd visited her many times before, this time felt different. It was just the two of us, and the house seemed quieter, more intimate somehow. I followed her inside, and as we settled in, I noticed things about her that I hadn't before. The way her silver hair caught the light, the graceful way she moved through the house. She was unlike any other grandmother I'd ever known, still full of life, with an effortless style that made her seem more youthful than her years. Over the next few days, we settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, we'd have breakfast together, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen as we chatted about the plans for the day. Sometimes we'd go for walks around the neighborhood, or spend hours in her garden, pulling weeds and watering flowers under the warm summer sun. In the evenings, we'd cook dinner together. She'd tell me stories about her youth, tales of love, travel, and adventure that made her life sound like a novel. Listening to her, I felt as if I was seeing her for the first time, not just as my grandmother, but as someone with a rich, complex past. One evening, after a particularly hot day, we decided to watch an old movie in the living room. She brought out a bottle of wine, offering me a glass with a knowing smile. "Don't tell your mother," she joked, her eyes twinkling. "But I think you're old enough for a little wine." I laughed, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with her. The wine, the quietness of the evening, and the dim light made the atmosphere feel unusually cozy, almost intimate. We sat close on the couch, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt. It felt different, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The next day, after working in the garden for a few hours, I decided to cool off with a shower. The sun had left my skin sticky and warm, and the water felt refreshing as it washed away the day's heat. I closed my eyes, letting the water relax my muscles, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my grandmother, her laughter, the sparkle in her eyes, the warmth of her smile. As I stood under the stream of water, I heard a soft knock on the bathroom door. "Are you all right in there?" she called, her voice muffled but gentle. "Yeah, just cooling off," I replied, feeling my cheeks flush despite myself. There was a brief pause before she responded. "All right, dear. Let me know if you need anything." Her words were simple, but something in her tone, a softness, a warmth, left me feeling unsettled. It was just a passing moment, a simple question, yet it lingered in my mind long after I'd stepped out of the shower. That evening at dinner, I found myself glancing at her more often, noticing little things I hadn't before, the graceful way she moved, the way she'd tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the sound of her laughter. She caught my eye once or twice, her gaze lingering just a second longer than usual, as if she could sense my thoughts. I shook it off, convincing myself that I was just overthinking things. Over the following days, the rhythm of our time together became almost comforting, like a well-rehearsed dance. We'd talk, laugh, and share stories, each moment bringing us closer in a way that felt natural, yet somehow charged. I noticed that her touch lingered a little longer when she'd pat my shoulder, or that her gaze would linger on mine when we'd laugh at a shared joke. One evening, as we were washing dishes together, she reached over and playfully flicked some water at me, laughing when I splashed her back. "Hey!" I protested, grinning as I tried to dodge her attack. She laughed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You can't escape that easily," she teased, her voice filled with a warmth that made my heart skip a beat. Without thinking, I reached over and wrapped my arms around her in a playful hug, pulling her close. For a moment, we stood there, caught in the quiet intimacy of the moment, our laughter fading into a comfortable silence. She looked up at me, her smile softening. "You're such a good boy," she murmured, her voice gentle. I felt my cheeks flush, a strange warmth spreading through me. "Thanks, Grandma," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. Her hand lingered on my arm, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes, a softness, a vulnerability that I hadn't noticed before. It was just a fleeting moment, but it left my heart racing. A few days later, after another long, hot day in the garden, I decided to take a shower to cool off. I stepped into the bathroom, letting the water wash away the dirt and sweat from the day's work. I closed my eyes, the heat of the water relaxing my muscles, and my thoughts drifted to my grandmother. Her laughter, her warmth, the gentle way she'd hold my hand during our evening talks. But then, just as I was rinsing off, I heard a soft knock on the door. "Are you all right, darling?" she called, her voice soft and caring. "Yeah, just finishing up," I replied, feeling my cheeks flush. There was a brief pause, and then, to my surprise, the door opened a crack. "Sorry to interrupt. I thought you might need a fresh towel," she said, stepping inside with a warm, fluffy towel in her hands. "Oh, thanks," I managed, my voice barely steady. She smiled, holding out the towel as she stepped closer, her gaze meeting mine. There was a warmth in her eyes, a quiet affection that made my heart skip a beat. I took the towel from her, mumbling my thanks, and as she turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of longing, a desire for her to stay. "Grandma," I said softly, barely even realizing I'd spoken. She paused, turning to look at me, her expression soft. "Yes, dear?" I hesitated, feeling a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite explain. I just wanted to say thanks. "For everything," she smiled, her gaze lingering on mine. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. I'm just happy to have you here." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the warmth of her presence filling the room. I wanted to reach out to hold her hand, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. "Good night," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she turned and left, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't quite understand. After that evening, the quiet moments between my grandmother and me took on a new depth. It was as if the boundaries between us had subtly shifted, making way for a connection that felt stronger, more personal. I found myself looking forward to our shared moments, our conversations and laughter, the simple routines that had become an unexpected comfort. One evening, after another long day in the garden, we sat together on the porch, sipping iced tea as the sun set behind the trees. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the quiet rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze created a sense of peace that wrapped around us like a soft blanket. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "it's been a long time since I've had someone to share these evenings with." I looked at her, seeing the quiet loneliness in her eyes, a loneliness that I'd never noticed before. "I'm glad to be here with you, Grandma," I replied, feeling a pang of sadness at the thought of her being alone. She smiled, her gaze warm and gentle. "I feel like I'm getting to know you all over again. You're not the little boy I remember. You've grown up so much." I felt my cheeks flush at her words, a quiet thrill running through me. "I guess it's hard to see those changes when you only see each other on holidays," I murmured, glancing down at my hands. She reached over, her fingers brushing my arm in a gentle, affectionate touch. "Well, I'm glad we have this time together now. It's special." The way she said it, the softness in her voice, made my heart skip a beat. There was something unspoken between us, a warmth that lingered in the air, making the silence feel almost intimate. The next day, we decided to take a break from the garden and spend the afternoon inside, sorting through old photo albums and keepsakes. She brought out a large, dusty box filled with memories from her younger years. Photographs, letters, little trinkets from a life that seemed both familiar and foreign. "Here's one of me when I was about your age," she said, holding up a black and white photo of a young woman with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. I took the photo from her, studying it closely. She looked so different, yet so much the same, youthful and full of life, with the same spark that I saw in her now. "You were beautiful," I murmured, surprised by the intensity of my own words. She laughed softly, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Oh, you're just flattering an old lady." "No, I mean it," I replied, my voice earnest. "I can see where I got my good looks from." She laughed again, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You've always had a way with words, haven't you?" As we continued looking through the photos, she told me stories of her past, of the places she'd traveled, the people she'd loved, the dreams she'd chased. Listening to her, I felt a new sense of admiration, a deeper understanding of the woman she was, not just as my grandmother, but as someone with her own dreams and desires. By the time we finished, the afternoon light had faded, leaving us in the soft glow of the setting sun. She looked at me, her gaze warm and filled with something I couldn't quite place, a mixture of affection and nostalgia, a quiet longing that left my heart racing. That evening, as we sat together after dinner, my grandmother poured us each a small glass of wine. She raised her glass, giving me a smile that was both mischievous and tender. "To new memories," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "To new memories," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. We sipped our wine in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to tell her how much this time with her meant to me, how much I appreciated her kindness, her wisdom, her warmth. But the words felt too heavy, too full of emotion, so I kept them to myself, letting the silence speak for me. After a while, she reached over, placing a gentle hand on mine. "You know," she murmured, "it's been a long time since I've felt this close to anyone." Her words struck a chord, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. I looked at her, seeing the softness in her gaze, the affection in her smile, and I realized that I felt the same way. This connection between us, this bond, was something I hadn't anticipated, but now that it was here, I couldn't imagine letting it go. The following day was even warmer than usual, and after working in the garden all morning, I was more than ready for a shower. I stepped into the bathroom, letting the cool water wash away the heat and grime from the day. The sound of the water was soothing, the steam rising around me, creating a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. But then, just as I was finishing up, there was a soft knock on the door. "Are you all right in there, darling?" Her voice called, gentle and caring. "Yeah, just finishing up," I replied, though my heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and she stepped inside, holding a fresh towel in her hands. "I thought you might need this," she said, her gaze warm and soft. "Oh, thanks," I managed, feeling my cheeks flush. She stepped closer, holding out the towel as she looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "You've been working so hard," she murmured. "It's good to take care of yourself, you know." "Yeah, I know," I replied, feeling a strange warmth spread through me. She handed me the towel, her fingers brushing against mine in a brief, gentle touch that left my heart racing. I wanted to say something, to express my gratitude, my admiration, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, caught in the warmth of her gaze, the closeness of her presence. For a moment, the world felt small, confined to the space between us, the quiet connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a warmth that left me breathless, and I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something I hadn't anticipated, something I wasn't ready to let go of. Later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, the air between us felt different, charged, intense, as if we were both aware of the shift that had taken place. She looked at me, her gaze lingering, and I felt a thrill, a quiet excitement that left me feeling both exhilarated and nervous. "Thank you for being here with me," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. This summer has been special. Yeah, it has, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. We sat in silence, the unspoken words filling the air around us. I wanted to tell her how much she meant to me, how grateful I was for this time with her. But the words felt too heavy, too full of emotion. Instead, I reached over, placing a gentle hand on hers, letting the silence speak for me. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a softness that left my heart racing, and for a moment, I thought she might say something that would put words to the feelings that had grown between us. But instead, she simply smiled, squeezing my hand in a gentle, reassuring gesture that spoke of understanding, of acceptance. And as we sat there, lost in the quiet warmth of the moment, I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something that would stay with me long after the summer had ended, a silent memory that I would carry with me, a reminder of the connection we had shared. Our days continued in the same quiet rhythm, each moment shared with my grandmother weaving us closer together. Every conversation, every shared glance held an unspoken depth, a warmth that left me feeling both comforted and exhilarated. It was as though we were both caught in a delicate balance, each aware of the line we were dancing on, yet unable to pull back. One afternoon, we decided to take a break from the house and go on a small hike through the nearby woods. She led the way, guiding me along the familiar trails that she'd walked countless times over the years. The dappled sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow over everything, and for a while, we walked in companionable silence. As we reached a clearing, she paused, looking out over the landscape with a thoughtful expression. I stood beside her, watching her, the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the calm confidence she exuded even in the quiet moments. "It's beautiful here," I murmured, more to myself than to her. She turned to me, a soft smile on her lips. "It is," she replied, "but it's even more beautiful when you have someone to share it with." Her words struck a chord, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet thrill that left me feeling unsettled. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to express the gratitude and affection that had been growing inside me. But instead, I kept my hands to myself, feeling the weight of the unspoken connection between us. That evening, after we'd returned from our walk, I found myself sitting with her in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over us. We'd been talking for hours, sharing stories and laughter, and as the evening wore on, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. At one point, she reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face with a gentle touch. "You look tired," she murmured, her voice soft. "Maybe a little," I admitted, feeling a blush creep onto my cheeks. She smiled, her hand lingering on my shoulder. "You've been working so hard, helping me with the garden and everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." There was a softness in her gaze, a warmth that left me feeling both comforted and something more. I looked at her, seeing her not just as my grandmother, but as someone who had become a source of strength and affection, someone who understood me in ways that few others did. For a moment, we sat in silence, her hand resting on my shoulder, a quiet understanding passing between us. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words felt too heavy, too full of emotion to speak aloud. Instead, I reached up, covering her hand with mine, letting the silence speak for me. The following evening, after a long day working around the house, my grandmother suggested we make a special dinner together. She brought out her old recipes, sharing stories of family gatherings and celebrations from years past as we cooked. The kitchen was filled with the warm, comforting aroma of homemade dishes, and the familiarity of it all made me feel closer to her than ever. As we sat down to eat, she raised her glass, giving me a soft smile. "To us," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "And to a summer I'll never forget." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling a surge of emotion. "To us," I echoed, my voice barely more than a whisper. The meal was filled with laughter and quiet moments, our connection deepening with each passing minute. By the time we'd finished, the air between us felt thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. She looked at me across the table, her gaze lingering, and I felt my heart race. "Thank you for being here with me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "This time together has meant more to me than you know." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "I feel the same way," I replied, my voice filled with sincerity. Her hand tightened around mine, and for a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our connection settling over us. I knew that this bond, this closeness, was something rare, something that would stay with me long after the summer ended. And as we sat there, lost in the quiet warmth of the moment, I realized that I didn't want this feeling to end. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down on me. My grandmother and I had shared so many moments, each one more intimate than the last, and though we never crossed any lines, there was a tension between us that I couldn't ignore. After breakfast, she suggested that we spend the day indoors, sorting through some old boxes in the attic. As we worked side by side, sifting through memories and keepsakes, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. At one point, she handed me an old photo album, her fingers brushing against mine in a brief, gentle touch. I looked at her, seeing the softness in her gaze, the warmth in her smile, and felt a surge of affection that left me feeling confused. "You've always been so dear to me," she murmured, her voice filled with emotion. "I feel so lucky to have this time with you." Her words struck a chord, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. I wanted to tell her how much she meant to me, how grateful I was for this time together, but the words felt too heavy, too full of emotion. Instead, I reached over, placing a gentle hand on her arm, letting the silence speak for me. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a softness that left my heart racing, and I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something I hadn't anticipated, something I wasn't ready to let go of. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. My grandmother and I had shared so many moments, each one filled with a warmth and affection that I hadn't expected, and though I knew that this summer would eventually come to an end, I couldn't shake the feeling that this connection was something more. She looked at me, her gaze soft and thoughtful. "You know, I don't think I've ever felt so close to anyone," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Her words struck a chord, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet thrill that left me feeling breathless. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to tell her how much this time together had meant to me, but the words felt too heavy, too full of emotion to speak aloud. Instead, I looked at her, letting the silence speak for me, and in that moment, I felt a sense of understanding pass between us, a quiet acceptance of the bond we had shared. And as we sat there, lost in the quiet warmth of the moment, I realized that this connection, this closeness, was something that would stay with me long after the summer had ended, a memory that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The final days of summer seemed to pass in a haze of shared moments, quiet conversations, and lingering touches. Every interaction, every glance, felt charged, filled with a silent understanding that neither of us dared to voice. My grandmother and I had settled into a rhythm that felt natural, comfortable, yet somehow delicate, as if a single word could shatter the closeness we'd built. One evening, after a long, warm day, we were sitting on the back porch, the setting sun casting a golden light over the garden. She looked over at me, her gaze thoughtful, and I felt a quiet thrill as her eyes lingered on mine. "Thank you for being here with me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This time together has been precious." I looked at her, feeling my heart swell with emotion. "It's meant a lot to me too, Grandma," I replied, my voice thick with sincerity. She reached over, her hand resting gently on mine, and for a moment, we sat there in silence, the warmth of her touch spreading through me. I wanted to say more, to express the depth of my gratitude, my affection, but the words felt too heavy, too full of meaning. After we went back inside, I decided to take a quick shower. The day's heat had left my skin sticky, and the water felt refreshing as it cascaded over me, washing away the dust and grime. I closed my eyes, letting the water relax my muscles, but my mind kept drifting back to my grandmother. Her gentle smile, the warmth in her gaze, the quiet moments we'd shared. But just as I was finishing up, I heard a soft knock on the door. "Are you all right, dear?" Her voice called, gentle and caring. "Yes, just finishing up," I replied, though my heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice. There was a brief pause, and then, to my surprise, the door opened a crack, and she stepped inside with a fresh towel in her hands. "Sorry, I thought you might need this," she said, her tone warm and calm. "Oh, thank you," I managed, feeling my cheeks flush as she handed me the towel. She stepped closer, her gaze soft as she looked at me, and for a moment, I felt the warmth of her presence fill the room. The water was still running, steam rising around us, creating a sense of intimacy that left me feeling both comforted and something more. I took the towel from her, feeling the brief, gentle brush of her fingers against mine, and as she turned to leave, I felt a quiet pang of something I couldn't quite explain, a longing, a sense of wanting her to stay just a moment longer. That evening, as we sat together after dinner, there was a knock on the front door. We both froze, exchanging a glance, and my grandmother's face paled slightly. "Your parents weren't supposed to be back yet," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and tension. We stood, and I followed her to the front door, my heart pounding. She opened it, and there they were, my parents, smiling with excitement, their arms filled with luggage. "Surprise!" my mother called out, her voice bright. "We decided to come home a little early." I forced a smile, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. "Hi, Mom. Dad. I didn't expect you back so soon." My mother looked between us, her smile fading slightly as her gaze lingered on the two of us. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone light but filled with a hint of suspicion. "Of course," my grandmother replied, her voice calm but her expression tense. "We've just been enjoying some time together." My mother's gaze flickered between us, and I could feel her uncertainty, her subtle curiosity about the connection we shared. It was as if she sensed something different, something that she couldn't quite put into words, and I felt a pang of unease. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house felt different. My parents' presence seemed to break the quiet intimacy that my grandmother and I had built, and I could feel them watching us, their gazes lingering whenever we shared a look or a gentle smile. My mother seemed particularly alert, her eyes filled with questions she didn't dare ask. One afternoon, as my grandmother and I were working in the garden, my mother joined us, her expression thoughtful. "You two seem close," she remarked, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. My grandmother looked up, giving her a gentle smile. "It's been wonderful having him here," she replied, her voice steady. "We've just been spending some time together, that's all." My mother nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the subtle suspicion that lingered just beneath the surface. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything was fine, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in a mix of emotions I couldn't quite explain. Later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, my mother glanced at me, her gaze lingering with an intensity that left me feeling exposed. "Are you sure everything's okay?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, Mom, everything's fine." But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of the unspoken connection between my grandmother and me, a connection that neither of us could explain, yet one that lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The following morning, I was in the bathroom, washing up after another long day spent helping around the house. I let the water wash over me, my thoughts drifting back to the quiet moments I'd shared with my grandmother, the warmth of her presence, the gentle affection that had grown between us. But just as I finished rinsing off, the door opened, and my mother stepped inside, her face pale, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I felt my cheeks flush, a wave of guilt washing over me as I tried to find the words to explain. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," I stammered, feeling my heart pound in my chest. But the look in her eyes, the hurt and betrayal, was more painful than any words she could have spoken. She glanced between us, her gaze filled with suspicion, and I knew that whatever bond my grandmother and I had shared, whatever connection we'd felt, was now out in the open, exposed in a way we'd never intended. In the days that followed, the quiet intimacy between my grandmother and me seemed to dissolve, replaced by a tension that neither of us could ignore. My mother's suspicion lingered in the air, a silent accusation that made each moment feel heavy, uncomfortable. I wanted to explain, to tell her that what we'd shared was innocent, that there was nothing to be suspicious of. But the words felt hollow, too full of complexity to explain in any simple way. The bond we'd shared was something unique, something that I would carry with me, a quiet memory that would stay with me long after the summer had ended. And though we never spoke about it again, I knew that this connection, this closeness, was something that had changed us both, leaving us with a silent understanding that would linger long after the summer had passed. The days that followed my parents' unexpected return felt like a dream, a strange, uncomfortable blur of tension and silence. My mother's suspicious glances, my father's quiet unease, and my own growing guilt created an atmosphere that was hard to bear. The house, once so full of warmth and laughter, now felt heavy with unspoken accusations, each glance a reminder of the bond my grandmother and I had shared. One evening, as we were all sitting around the dinner table, my mother set down her fork, her expression serious. "I think we should talk about what happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper. My heart pounded, and I could see the tension in my grandmother's face as well. She looked at my mother, her expression calm, but I could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "There's nothing to talk about," my grandmother replied gently. "We spent time together, got to know each other better. That's all." My mother shook her head, her gaze intense. "It's more than that, Mom. I can see it. There's something between you two, and I don't understand it." The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. I wanted to explain, to tell my mother that the bond we'd shared was innocent, that there was no reason for suspicion, but the words wouldn't come. My grandmother placed a hand on mine, her touch gentle and reassuring. "I'm sorry if we caused you concern," she said softly, "but I assure you, there's nothing you need to worry about." Her words seemed to calm my mother slightly, but I could still see the doubt in her eyes, a doubt that wouldn't easily be dispelled. The next morning, my parents quietly informed me that we'd be leaving early. They didn't say much, but the disappointment in their eyes was clear. I could feel the weight of their unspoken suspicions, their quiet distrust, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. When I told my grandmother the news, she looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I see," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss that left me feeling hollow. I don't want to leave like this," I said, my voice trembling. She reached over, taking my hand in hers. "This summer has meant a lot to me," she said softly. "And I hope you'll remember it fondly, despite everything." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "I will," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our unspoken connection settling over us. I wanted to say more, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words felt too heavy, too filled with emotion. The morning of our departure was quiet, subdued. My parents were distant, their expressions filled with a mixture of disappointment and confusion. My grandmother and I exchanged a final glance, a silent goodbye that left my heart aching. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss, a quiet emptiness that filled the space where her presence had been. The summer had changed me, had left me with a bond, a connection that I couldn't explain. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I found myself replaying each moment, each memory, a silent reminder of everything I had left behind. As time passed, the memories of that summer remained vivid in my mind. My grandmother and I never spoke about it again, but the bond we'd shared, the closeness we'd found, stayed with me, a silent reminder of a time when I had felt truly understood. I realized that the connection we'd shared was something rare, something that had changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was a bond that couldn't be defined, couldn't be put into words, yet it was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And though the summer had ended, and life had returned to its usual rhythm, I knew that I would always remember those quiet moments, those shared glances, the warmth of her presence, a memory that would remain with me, a part of who I had become.